welcome to American Catholic History, brought to you by the support of listeners like you. If you value this podcast, please become a supporter at americancatholichistory.org/support. Also, please help others find us by sharing this episode and giving us a 5-star rating. Those really help. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crowe.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Today we're talking about Frank Capra, the Christmas Catholic Hollywood man who wrote, produced, and directed some of the most important and deeply Catholic films of Hollywood's golden era. I'll bet most people don't realize how many great films he made in his day. Most people just think of his 1946 masterpiece, It's a Wonderful Life, when they hear Frank Capra's name.
Yeah, and that's not really a bad thing. It is a wonderful film, and he actually considered it his most important work. But few know how many other great films he was responsible for. Films that actually received more critical acclaim in their day than It's a Wonderful Life.
Yes, he'd actually been nominated for 6 Oscars before directing It's a Wonderful Life. He'd won Best Director for It Happened One Night, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, and You Can't Take It With You. He also was nominated for Lady for a Day, Lost Horizon, and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And then he was nominated for Best Director for It's a Wonderful Life, but didn't win.
Yeah, and with a resume like that, Capra has a case for being considered the GOAT of directors.
Well, Hitchcock might have something to say about that, but also I see what you did there.
Yeah.
Dear listeners, capra is the Italian word for goat, so Tom is punning across languages.
Yes, and it's hilarious.
Sort of funny. I'll give you that.
I'll take it.
Yeah. Back to Capra the director. There's a theme that runs through Capra's movies. Good people living good lives, but who are chewed up and spit out by the harshness of reality. But in the end, their goodness wins out. Naturally, those people who might feel accused by such a motif might not appreciate the constant victory of simple goodness. People like Hollywood critics of the 60s and 70s, when what they wanted was shock and edginess. So these critics came up with a term for his films, capra-corn, because they considered them to be too light and fluffy and too much wishful thinking to be worth anything.
But they are hoist on their own petard, because Capricorn is the name of the constellation that is a goat, so the critics were actually agreeing with me. He's the goat among the stars.
Yeah.
That's even punnier.
Yeah. If only they were that clever.
No, they weren't. But again, they didn't realize what they were saying. Capra's films had a vision of life that was actually very Catholic, very human and sacrificial, without having any explicit religious themes or symbolism.
But Capra wasn't a lifelong practicing church-going Catholic. In fact, in his 20s and 30s, Capra called himself a Christmas Catholic. So, well, let's tell our listeners a little bit more about his background.
Sure thing. So Frank Capra was born in Sicily on May 18th, 1897. He was the youngest of 7 surviving children. His parents came to the U.S. in 1903, coming through Ellis Island when Frank was just 6 years old. They settled in Los Angeles. His father was a fruit picker, and his mother raised him and his 6 surviving siblings. His parents were devout Catholics, and the kids all got a foundation in the faith, even if, like Frank, they didn't adhere to it throughout their lives.
But something we talked about with Babe Ruth in a previous episode seems to have been true of Capra also. Ruth talked about having a solid little chapel inside. He said that though kids may rebel, they get the faith where it counts, down in their roots, and it stays with them and never fails. That seems to have been the case with Capra.
Right. He may have wandered away from the faith, but it didn't wander away from him. It was there, ready for him, when he was once again ready for it. So Capra worked his way through college and earned a degree in chemical engineering.
Chemical engineering. Not exactly the sort of college studies that leads to a career as a Hollywood director.
No, I guess not.
Right?
Probably not typically.
Yeah.
But with where movie-making technology was headed, it was actually a fortunate degree for him. More on that very soon.
So with a chemical engineering degree in hand, he got a job in the 1920s as a writer for Hal Roach and his Our Gang series.
Exactly what you'd expect of a chemical engineer.
Right. After working with Roach for a time, who moved on to work with silent film comic star Harry Langdon. The character that he helped Langdon develop showed the first signs of what would be this very Catholic thread in his own films: a simple, fundamentally good person whose only ally is God, in a world where bad things happen. Langdon's character basically just had to rely on God for all good things.
He signed on with Columbia Pictures at the end of the 1920s. Columbia at the time wasn't a frontline production company, but Capra was poised to make his mark while there. With the shift to talkies happening, that is, movies with sound, directors had to go about their work very differently, and this is where his engineering background came in handy.
Yes, Capra, with his engineering education, was one of the very few directors who easily grasped the changes in technology with the new sound recording equipment, and so he was ahead of his peers in directing talkies. Success came quickly for him.
His first mega hit was It Happened One Night in 1934. It was the first film to sweep the top 5 Oscars: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay. He directed one more film in 1934, Broadway Bill, but with his rapid rise of success, he had a bit of a crisis of faith. He was 37 and again hadn't been the most devout Catholic for a while.
His personal crisis was prompted by something someone said to him. His star was rising, and he was beginning to take himself and his own abilities very seriously. No one's quite certain who said it to him, but the person said, "The talents you have, Mr. Capra, are not your own, not self acquired. God gave you those talents. They are His gifts to you to use for His purpose. And when you don't use the gifts God blessed you with, you are an offense to God and to humanity."
Those strong words struck Capra and changed everything for him, not just his future film projects. He even began to turn back to his Catholic faith.
Now, that part took many years and was helped along by his wife, Lucille.
But this experience and the soul searching that it prompted led to a series of 4 great films over the next 6 years. All of them were nominated for Academy Awards. Mr. Deeds Goes to Town in 1936, Lost Horizon in 1937, You Can't Take It With You in 1938, and the classic Mr. Smith Goes to Washington in 1939.
He said of his new focus in filmmaking, "My films must let every man, woman, and child know that God loves them, that I love them, and that peace and salvation will become a reality only when they all learn to love each other."
And he set out to do that. The first of the films he made after this mini conversion was Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, starring Gary Cooper, another Catholic with a fraught story. We told his story of redemption in another episode. Mr. Deeds Goes to Town features a simple and good-natured man who is abused and mistreated by everyone around him, including by people whom he has reason to trust, but who betray him. It is only by remaining a good and decent man that Deeds is able to overcome the evil.
Capra said that doing Mr. Deeds gave him, quote, "a golden opportunity to dramatize love thy neighbor as thyself. Christ's spiritual law can be the most powerful sustaining force in anyone's life."
The author Graham Greene reviewed the film and identified Capra's formula as the theme of goodness and simplicity manhandled in a deeply selfish and brutal world. That theme would carry through subsequent films. You Can't Take It With You, based on the play of the same name, is about an eccentric and very happy family that doesn't worry about living sensibly in the ways the world thinks of living sensibly. They clash with the wealthy and sensible, but ultimately miserable, family of their daughter's fiancé.
Yeah, again, simplicity, goodness, and detachment win out over worldly success.
Exactly. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, starring Jimmy Stewart, features a simple man who believes in the goodness and integrity of everyone he's going to work with in Washington. The fool. And once he's there, he gets rolled by the machinations of the power brokers in government. In the end, his fundamental goodness awakens the consciences of some of those around him.
Actor Richard Griffiths characterized Capra's typical hero as a messianic innocent, someone who would be initially defeated by his own lack of experience and knowledge, but whose integrity and courage would see him outlast his foes and inspire others to goodness.
In 1940, Capra himself told the New Yorker magazine, "It sounds sappy, but the underlying idea of my movies is the Sermon on the Mount, a plus value of some kind, along with entertainment."
When the U.S. entered World War II, Capra voluntarily enlisted in the Army, though he was in his 40s. He was tasked by General George Marshall with making the Why We Fight series of films used by the Army to help soldiers better understand the reasons for American involvement in the war. He later regarded the Why We Fight films to be the most important thing he did. The first of them, Prelude to War, actually won the Academy Award for Best Documentary.
He went back to Hollywood after the war, where he and 2 other directors started their own production company, Liberty Films, and the first film Liberty produced was It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah, and the thing about this film is how deeply and widely Catholic it is.
Absolutely. George Bailey, played of course by Jimmy Stewart, has dreams and ambitions, but he also has a sacrificial nature. He is quick, if not eager, to put others' needs ahead of his own dreams. He saves his brother from drowning and loses hearing in one ear. He gives loans to people who desperately need the money, but who likely cannot pay the loans back. He gives up his dreams of traveling to carry on his father's work of helping the less fortunate. For his efforts and sacrifice, he faces ruin.
The villain, Mr. Potter, on the other hand, is a miserly, miserable, materialist, greedy man who will not help anyone and who will not be moved to compassion.
Bailey, in a moment of despair, is given the opportunity to see what the world would have been like if he had never been born. He sees how different would be the lives of his family and his town if he had never existed. The experience changes him and gives him the strength to face the consequences, and his trouble inspires his friends and relations to come through and help him when he is in desperate need of their aid.
The reason Bailey gets that opportunity is because of the people who are praying for him. The film is an incredible depiction of the communion of saints, that cloud of witnesses, and the power of prayer.
A few interesting tidbits about It's a Wonderful Life that make it just so powerful. First, this was the first film Jimmy Stewart did after he'd been in the crucible of World War II. And if you know about Stewart's military career, that dude was a legend. Stewart's wartime experience was vital for the pivotal scene on the bridge when George Bailey is contemplating suicide. This scene was raw and real for Stewart. He wasn't merely acting at that point or at other parts where he had to portray angst and pain and trauma. He was just letting the war trauma flow.
The second tidbit is the prayer scene at Martini's bar. It was written to be all wide shots. There were no cameras taking close-ups of Stewart. But Stewart played it with such raw emotion. The tears were something that just came. Capra asked Stewart to do it again so he could get the close-up. And Stewart said he could not do it again. So Capra ordered his film technician crew to spend many, many hours enlarging the many thousands of frames of film involved to get that close-up and accomplish the shot he knew he needed. The result is magic.
Yep. The third tidbit is that Stewart was the second choice for the role of George Bailey. The first was actually Cary Grant.
Yeah, and I cannot imagine Cary Grant in that role.
No, it wouldn't work. But in an interview many years later, Stewart said that when Capra approached him about the film, he was hesitant to tell Stewart about it. Capra was. But after giving a brief description of the plot, Stewart said, "Frank, if you want me to be in a picture about a guy that wants to kill himself, and an angel comes down named Clarence who can't swim, and I save him, when do we start?"
Stewart was amazing.
And that invitation wasn't.
Right. That's,
Anyway.
You know what I was not going to say.
That's all right. I said it for you.
The fourth tidbit is that the basic story had been written by a guy who sent a Christmas card to RKO Productions. He printed it on the card that he sent in. Capra liked it enough to have RKO purchase the rights to the story from the man. And then Capra worked with 3 different top-notch Hollywood writers to work up a script. But none of them quite captured what Capra knew the script needed to be. So he wrote the script himself.
Capra said this film was the ultimate result of that admonition he'd gotten back in 1934, that if you're not really using the talents and gifts that God gave you, you are an offense to God and to humanity. Likewise, if you do use them, you have no idea how much good you really can and will do.
He said of It's a Wonderful Life that it was the greatest film he ever made. He said it is a film to tell the weary, the disheartened, the disillusioned, the wino, the junkie, the prostitute, those behind prison walls and those behind iron curtains, that no man is a failure, to show those born slow of foot or slow of mind, those oldest sisters condemned to spinsterhood, and those oldest sons condemned to unschooled toil, that each man's life touches so many others, and that if he isn't around, it would leave an awful hole.
Interestingly, It's a Wonderful Life was supposed to be released in January 1947, but another film project which Liberty had planned to be their Christmas release was delayed, so It's a Wonderful Life was moved up a few weeks, and it actually premiered on December 20th, 1946.
In part because of being pushed up like that, It's a Wonderful Life didn't enjoy great success in its initial theater run, and it was largely forgotten soon after.
And that was a bit of a coda on Capra's film career. The 1950s and 60s brought the era when the capra-corn epithet was really used to talk down his storytelling style. Storytelling in Hollywood changed. Viewers and critics in those decades were too cynical to be moved by Capra's Catholic vision.
And the film industry had changed, and Capra took on that change in his 1971 autobiography, The Name Above the Title.
Yeah, this book somewhat resurrected his career and renewed interest in his films. In it, he explained so much about his work and explained why he walked away from the film industry. In one tight passage, he explained his disgust with where Hollywood had gone. Quote, "The winds of change blew through the dream factories of make-believe, tore at its crinoline tatters. The hedonists, the homosexuals, the hemophiliac bleeding hearts, the God-haters, the quick-buck artists who substituted shock for talent, all cried, 'Shake 'em, rattle 'em, God is dead, long live pleasure. Nudity? Yeah. Wife-swapping? Yeah. Liberate the world from prudery. Emancipate our films from morality. Kill for thrill. Shock. Shock. To hell with good in man. Dredge up his evil. Shock. Shock.'"
Yeah, and he had many more choice things to say about the degradation of Hollywood.
More choice than that, that'd be pretty remarkable.
Yeah, well, accurate.
Yeah.
And colorful. They're not appropriate for a family-friendly podcast.
Yeah,
That's
no.
as far as we're going.
Right, yeah. And while Hollywood has mostly gone downhill from there, It's a Wonderful Life has enjoyed a renaissance.
Yeah, in 1976, a clerical error at the studio allowed the copyright on the film to lapse, and it entered public domain.
A providential error. I wonder if Clarence, once he got his wings, had a hand in that clerical error.
Well, however it happened, network television began to air It's a Wonderful Life every Christmas. The rights were purchased by NBC in 1994, but not until after the film enjoyed a reevaluation. Since then, it has been placed on many lists of the greatest films ever made.
Now, what the experts insisted upon, what those who know better said, didn't rule the day. The people have found themselves drawn to this film and have made it an Advent and Christmas staple.
Yeah, well, that's the way with beauty.
Yeah, absolutely.
And powerful storytelling.
Right, yes. Capra explained this in relation to his own Catholicism when he said he was a Catholic in spirit, one who firmly believes that the anti-moral, the intellectual bigots, and the mafias of ill will may destroy religion, but they will never conquer the cross.
And Capra lived this message in his later decades. In 1972, he became a Knight of Malta under the sponsorship of fellow Catholic director John Ford. And for the last 13 years of his life, he served as an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion.
Capra lived to be 94 years old, dying in 1991 after a series of strokes. But he left behind a body of work that speaks of eternal truths and emphasizes the power of goodness, two themes so sorely needed.
Or, as he described his own filmmaking, mankind needed dramatizations of the truth that man is essentially good, a living atom of divinity, that compassion for others, friend or foe, is the noblest of all virtues. Films must be made to say these things, to counteract the violence and the meanness, to buy time, to demobilize the hatreds. We hope you all find time to enjoy It's a Wonderful Life this Advent and Christmas season. Merry Christmas, everyone.
Merry Christmas.
This has been American Catholic History. If you enjoy American Catholic History, please become a supporter. We've got great perks for supporters. Get information on how to become a supporter and the perks at americancatholichistory.org/support.
Also, on our website, sign up for our newsletter, learn more about Frank Capra, see about our pilgrimages and merch, and find other great stories from American Catholic history.
We also love the great reviews our listeners leave. Those in the 5-star ratings help others find us. You can email us feedback, questions, tips for episode topics, or other comments at feedback@americancatholichistory.org. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/American Catholic History, on Instagram at ACH_podcast, and follow us on Twitter at ACH1513. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crow.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Thank you once again for joining us on American Catholic History, made possible by listeners like you.